So welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Lubarsky and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. For nearly 3 decades, the Hall has worked to discover and share the stories of women. Our various educational platforms acknowledge the individual and collective feminine voice. There is no more important time than now to talk and to listen. This will be a half-hour intimate and informative chat followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time during this webinar by clicking on the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Our goal is simple, a virtual gathering to talk about today's important issues. We hope this will be a useful source of information while offering up helpful takeaways. Before I introduce our guest, I want you to know that we'll have resources and information on our screen at the end of this webinar, as well as on our website. We are honored today to have as our guest Joanne Martin, a licensed professional counselor. She specializes in generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and relationship issues, using a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy. She works with clients to increase understanding of the root influences of their behaviors while also giving clients practical tools that will promote change. Joanne has been a member of various statewide agencies focusing on children's well-being and served as the co-chair of the Medical Forensic Interviewing Task Force for the Governor's Task Force on Justice for Abused Children. She heads Breakwater Counseling Center in Stratford, Connecticut, which provides therapy to individuals, couples, families struggling with relationships, parenting, and the ever-changing landscape of one's life. And boy, are things ever-changing. Welcome, Joanne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to see you again.
As is it to see you from across the screen. And just to let you know, you're a little lag time on my screen, so okay. I don't know if others are experiencing that, but just in case.
Well, then we'll wait. So if I seem to interrupt you, you'll have to excuse me as we go along.
Okay.
So Joanne, why don't we get started? In this series of webinars, we wish to provide an audience more insight into various ways the pandemic has and will continue to impact us. In particular, its impact on women. And in today's webinar, we're looking for some information and practical tools that can help our audience cope with this ongoing stressor. Before we get further into the conversation, can you talk just a bit about your counseling philosophy and give us a brief definition of cognitive behavior therapy and psychotherapy and how you implement each treatment when working with your clients? It's a mouthful, Joanne. Simplify it for us.
Yes, it is a mouthful. That's why I call it CBT. So we'll refer to it as CBT moving forward. CBT was developed by Albert Ellis back in the 50s, almost in a response to more of that Freudian type of psychoanalysis in some ways, especially working with people with depression. And his theory, and I think what has been moving forward and tends to be much more recognized in modern therapy and counseling, is that how important our thinking is, how our thoughts affect our feelings and our feelings affect our behavior. And if we think about our thoughts, sometimes we don't even know where they come from. Sometimes they just pop up, but we give them a lot of weight. So we believe that they're true. And in his theory, he's basically saying, if we can start somewhere in the process of this thought, feeling, behavior model, that we can check, is this thought accurate? Is this thought true? Because that might change our feeling around it. And the feeling is then going to change how we behave around it.
Wow, very interesting. I know that I spend a lot of time trying to speak in the positive and be in the positive. So that's really interesting. So what types of reactions and issues are you seeing as a result of the pandemic? And how do you think the pandemic will affect our nation's, emotional well-being overall? And maybe you can talk a little bit about fear and anxiety.
Well, the pandemic seems to encapsulate so many things that are going to naturally create worry, fear, things that will lead to anxiety, things that can lead to depression. And I want to also clarify a little bit that when we talk about just anxiety, for example, we might have test anxiety. That's a normal reaction to being worried about taking a test. And that is as a result of something that's present. And as soon as we finish taking the test, or maybe even halfway through the test, that seems to dissipate and go away. When we talk about diagnosing something like generalized anxiety disorder or phobias, social anxiety, those are things that are really interfering in our life. So I may go back and forth between the two because there's probably a lot of people that are listening right now that don't necessarily have generalized anxiety disorder or phobias or social anxiety, but they might be feeling a lot of anxiety due to the pandemic. And that is in some ways more similar to how we would feel, an example, for test anxiety. There is this thing in front of us that we're trying to deal with. It's a real thing. We don't have a lot of control over it. We have control over things like washing our hands, social distancing, staying connected with people, but we don't have control over what the pandemic is doing, which is shutting down businesses, which is people are getting sick. Unfortunately, some people are dying. All of those things are going to create anxious feelings within us. Part of that is super normal, and there's nothing wrong with having feelings like that. It's then what do we do with it? How do we process those feelings? What does it do to our life? How much is it affecting our life and our daily well-being? And so I guess basically my end message is that feeling anxious, feeling a bit depressed is normal, but keep an eye on yourself. If you feel like your functioning is decreasing, if you feel like you're getting to this place that your thinking is becoming very negative to the point where, okay, here's the pandemic, I'm worried about my job, you stop sleeping, maybe you stop eating, these things, you become more irritable, etc.
Yes, irritability, yes.
Yes.
So can we just kind of talk a little bit about who you think, who's struggling the most and why?
I think we're all struggling a little bit. Definitely the economy has been so greatly affected that I think those people that were struggling financially prior to the pandemic are probably feeling really the weight of and concern of what happens if I lose my job. Maybe they've already lost their job. What happens if my hours are cut? Maybe their hours have already been cut. That's a huge stressor on people. I think other people that are feeling it are the elderly. They're more at risk of getting sick. So they have that fear of getting sick and possibly it not turning out very well. They tend to be more socially isolated as well, which is harder during this time. We don't have the ability just to go out and go to a restaurant with our friends, or even just to go shopping by ourselves, but see and interact with other people.
Yeah.
Also, I think, obviously we've talked a lot about this, but our healthcare workers that are on the front line, I think they're in high function mode right now of I've got to get my job done. We'll see what happens after this pandemic ends and life returns normal for them.
And that's an interesting question. So if we get back to our new normal, do you think everybody's just gonna pick up and go on like before? Do they have to be worrying about maybe checking in with themselves after?
I think like other major crises that have happened or other major events, if we look at something like World War II or 9/11 and what happened after that, life changes in big ways and small ways. The fallout from this is hard to predict. It will be an ongoing process. I think the mental health issues related to it will probably increase, because I think a lot of people are in action mode right now, or they're having this quality of life that hasn't been that affected. And especially, I want to go back to the financial realm, because I think if you've lost a job, then if you're a hopeful person, you're going to think, I'm going to get another job, and hopefully the economy will support that. If the economy doesn't support that, I think that's going to create a lot of anxiety and stress and depression in people. I do think that there are some good things that might come out of this. I think that there are things like, I'm going to spend more time with my relatives. I'm going to spend more time with my parents, with my grandparents. I'm going to stay more connected to people.
Yes, I agree. I think that that's a very, very poignant point. So Joanne, as you mentioned, that identification or acknowledgement that someone may need outside assistance or guidance, could you speak to the progression of emotional issues with the focus on women in the pandemic? And maybe talk about a little bit how women deal with anxiety and depression differently than men, things like that.
Okay, so I didn't mention women in one of the most vulnerable populations, but they are. Women tend to be more economically challenged. Women tend to be the caretakers, sometimes the primary and only caretakers of the family. They tend to head more one-parent households, which means under these conditions, when you have kids home from school, maybe she's trying to work from home and maintain the house. Maybe she's also trying to care for elderly parents or grandparents. The weight gets stacked upon itself. I call it like Jenga. So we have this game of Jenga and we're adding these building blocks to it. And at what point does we're pulling one block out and then we're trying to stack it on top. So at what point does the structure crumble under the weight? Or at what point can I just not pull one more wood block out? And at what point can I not add it to the structure? As we're adding things on, it becomes more and more difficult. So I think women tend to probably be having a little bit more difficult time than men right now. I don't mean to be sexist, but I think it's true. I also think, well, I know women tend to already be more, they have a higher rate of anxiety and depression than men do. If you look at the nation as wide, 20% of Americans struggle with an anxiety disorder, but over 50% are women, and especially under the age of 50, it tends to the numbers seem to get higher. The percentage seems to get higher. Why that is probably has some biological basis. Women tend to process, certain neurotransmitters different. We also deal with things like our menstrual cycle, pregnancy, things that affect our hormones. So there's a combination of the two. Yeah. I think women, and just the caretaker role, I think that's happening right now with women, I think is difficult. I think it's really hard to have kids at home and trying to be homeschooling them and being with them all the time, not having any relief from that. Not that kids aren't great, they're fabulous. I have a couple of my own, but it's challenging, I love all the things that we're seeing on Facebook where you call your kids your coworkers. My coworker decided to bring a bucket of dirt and worms inside the house. So there's a lot to contend with right now.
Can you just talk a little bit about the feelings of being out of control, and to talk about what you can control and not control, and some helpful tips for people?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So what happens in anxiety is that we tend to try to control things that are out of our control because it gives us some relief, we think, from the anxiety, which is why we saw people buying 12,000 rolls of toilet paper. There's even been an uptick in gun purchases, things like that, thinking that if I'm prepared in the utmost degree that I can somehow ward off bad things from happening to me. Or on the flip side is a bad thing. If I don't do these things, bad things will happen. That we have some control over bad things happening to us, or some control over what will happen with the pandemic. If I can do these things, I will keep myself safe. I will keep my family safe. I think it's really important, and this is a tool that people can use, is to have a piece of paper and write what I have control over on one column and what I don't have control over on the other column. I don't have control over the fact that my business laid off half of the employees. I don't have control over that, and that I was one of them. I do have control over updating my resume and sending out my resume, or making phone calls to people that I know in the industry to see what's happening out there and if there's any available positions. So when we think we have control over things, you tend to see this in normal life, that we have control over people. If I do, if I have a person in my life or in my family that's having a problem, if I do X, Y, and Z, I can fix it. I can fix their problems. That's where we fall into codependency. So in trying to fix them, we feel like we're doing something. We feel proactive, but in reality, we're not controlling it. We're maybe having some social influence, but in the long run, if somebody decides to change their behavior, it's because of them. It's because they put something into action. So again, it's just important to say to people, because when you're, I'm going to call it spinning your wheels. When you're spinning your wheels, trying to control these things that are not in control, it doesn't really help with your anxiety. In fact, it makes it worse because the outcome is not going to be in your favor.
Yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the grief people might be feeling now, just because of the uncertainty and the future?
Sure. So grief is complicated. So we think of grief as when somebody passes away generally. But grief can cover a wide spectrum of things. And for those people that have lost somebody, grief is going to be a process. There's some, Kubler-Ross wrote the famous book about the stages of grief, which is an excellent book for somebody to buy if they're going through really any type of loss, because we go through that process in all types of situations. But grief can also encapsulate things like loss of a job, and not to keep going back to that, but loss of a job. It can encapsulate things like our life has changed. My lifestyle has changed. What I'm able to do has changed. Grief can encapsulate missing somebody. Grief can encapsulate the end of a relationship. So if we were used to even going to our yoga class and we had a really great group of women, supportive women in our yoga class, but we really didn't see them outside of yoga, we're missing those people. Yeah. And it feels like something's taken away from us. And it feels a little bit like we're grieving those people and that sort of bonding experience that we have in certain situations.
Yeah, and I'm sure if, depending on how things go in the future, we'll be grieving about the way we used to live our life, as you just said.
Yes.
So, so we have to take care of ourselves and learn how to breathe, right? So if a woman feels that all these things that we've been talking about and are happening to her and she feels less able to manage her symptoms in her life, what can she do during this time? Can you share some resources that everybody could have access to, and maybe talk about, the positive instead of the negative and things like that?
Mm-hmm. So to go back quickly to our thinking that's some of the things that we can do from a mental health perspective, and being a provider. I use a lot of techniques with my clients that are easily applied at home. There are books available to help you through the process of how do I start working on this negative thinking that I have, this worst case scenario thinking that I have, because that tends to lead to a lot of worry, which tends to lead to physiological symptoms. So that's where I'm going to start with that, is because I do that a lot in my practice. And when people start getting that concept that they can change those thoughts, or at least not give them so much power, their feelings become lessened. And when your feelings become lessened, everything changes. The way you behave changes. Your bodily reactions to that change. So if you're thinking all worst case scenario during the pandemic, and how horrible things are going to be, and how nothing will ever be the same, that even in the way you talk to yourself, that negative talking, those always and nevers, which we use, just be checking in on that. Of course, there are other things that we can do that not only, you know, lift our spirits just from doing them, but actually have physiological changes. Things like yoga is wonderful, which also includes breathing. I'll do a really brief breathing exercise at the end. Things like getting outside, getting back connected to nature, taking care of yourself, maybe taking a hot bath is helpful. Obviously, eating well is helpful. Getting enough sleep is helpful. All of these things you've probably been hearing over and over of practicing self-care, because as they say, you know, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. It tends to be true. So the problem in that sometimes is that we, I think, as women, also experience a lot of guilt. If I'm taking care of myself, I'm not taking care of somebody else, or I'm being selfish. And I think by not taking care of yourself in some ways, is being selfish, because your family needs you, your friends need you, your parents need you. And the better off you are, the better off everybody else is. So I say, take some time for yourself.
Yes, and I guess it's kind of like somebody stated the other day, you put your mask, when you're in a plane, you put your mask on before you put the mask on of your child, because if you're not in a good space, they won't be in a good space. So I know you're not a doctor, but could you talk a little bit about, you know, the neuroplasticity and just a little bit on that, Joanne, about the positive instead of the negative? I know you were just talking about it, but that there is proof out there.
There is absolute proof that our thinking affects our neurotransmitters. And so some of us know, we hear words like dopamine or serotonin or cortisol, not to get into the specifics of it, but there are certain neurotransmitters that operate not only in our brain, but in our gut. That's really an upcoming source of study of how our gut has neurotransmitters in it as well. And it's what they now are calling our second brain. And if you think about it, think about when you get anxious, you feel the butterflies in your stomach, or you get anxious and have some sort of bodily reaction we won't talk about right now. But think of there's neurotransmitters everywhere, and things that we do will affect those things. They will affect the serotonins and the dopamines and the cortisol. I'll talk a little bit about cortisol, because cortisol is a stress neurotransmitter. So during times of stress, we increase cortisol levels. There's also something, though, which is very, very interesting, which is called oxytocin. So what oxytocin is what I would call, it's the helping neurotransmitter, or it's actually kind of more the kind neurotransmitter. When we're under stress, and especially for women, is we have the releases of both of those neurotransmitters. So not only are we feeling the increases from our cortisol levels, but we also get increases from oxytocin, which is why you'll see in responses to things like the pandemic, this response of, I feel very anxious, but you know, it's going to make me feel good. I'm going to go bake a pie and bring it over and leave it on the doorstep of my neighbor. Those types of things are so important right now. If I can also recommend something else, is it's reaching out to other people, and even in your own grief or sadness or anxiety, is to try and help another person, and you will see the results of it almost immediately. And it's, again, so good for us physiologically.
That's a wonderful idea. I know I've been baking a lot more than I normally do. I guess we're going to have to watch the COVID-19 20 or 30, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. Joanne, before we go into questions, let's just reiterate things that people could do every day. I know we already talked about it, but let's just bring it on home and talk about the things that people could do to make themselves feel better and less anxious.
So most of the viewers, listeners have probably heard a lot of these things. It's like keeping a routine is important. taking care of yourself, getting up and showering and maybe putting on a little makeup if you wear makeup, maybe putting on something besides your sweatpants every once in a while. It's going to be helpful, those little things. I think it's also really important to check your thinking. You know, if you feel like your thinking is getting more negative, I call it going down the rabbit hole. If you feel like you're going down the rabbit hole, is to pull yourself back. Journaling can be very, very effective. If you're feeling under a lot of stress and you're feeling like you don't have anybody to talk to, journaling is a great exercise to do. Write it out. It will also be a little diary of this time in your life that you'll look back on in, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and remember what it was like during this time, because obviously we're in a historical period of time. I think also getting outside, whether you like to exercise or not like to exercise, just getting out and appreciating nature, taking a little walk, hugging your kids, hugging your husband, making yourself some comfort food, all of these things. And also, as you said, Sarah, is to breathe. And I teach this to my clients, and I call it the 4x4. Actually, it was developed by the Navy SEAL. So they have quite a bit of stress sometimes in their lives. And it's just breathing in and breathing out. 4 seconds in and 4 seconds out 4 times. It's an easy, easy thing to remember. It's an easy, easy thing to do. And just keeping a hopeful spirit and helping others in the way that feels comfortable for you.
That's wonderful. And I mean, I know that with, giving yourself positive messages at the hall, we're always saying, quoting Billie Jean King, the famous tennis player, saying, you have to see it to be it. And I think thinking, you have to keep thinking it and looking at it in your mind's eye to be it. So I think that's fabulous. So we're almost to the end of our time, but there are some, I think I have one question here, and I'm sure if anybody has a question, please put them in the Q&A box so that I can see them. We have one here. What about, you talked a little bit about this before, but maybe we can get into it a little bit more. What about diet? Studies show that certain foods affect our attention span, outlook, sleep, while at home. And the fridge door seems to appear to be revolving.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, that's absolutely true. There are certain foods, as I talk about neurotransmitters, there are certain foods that also help those good neurotransmitters. I'm not going to go into all the specifics. I think that we know about healthy diet leads to more healthy thinking and a healthy lifestyle. One of the things I will say, the things to avoid, again, which we probably all know, are things like excessive sugar, excessive alcohol or other types of mood-altering substances, excessive junk food, all these things that we do, and to us it feels like comfort food. I think the better you take care of your body, the better your body's going to respond to that. But there are things such as, green leafy vegetables that will change, starting when you think about it with our second brain, right? So they consider the digestive tract as producing most of our serotonin. And if you look at antidepressants, that's what antidepressants fix, basically, is either the levels of serotonin or the way they're transmitted. So thinking about our second brain and thinking about eating a healthy diet, one with a little bit of protein, mostly fruits and vegetables, a certain level of carbs, try to think about the healthy carbs. We're taking care of our second brain as well.
Yeah, I think.
But it is kind of normal to really want a big bowl of ice cream at the end of the night, which I won't say I've been doing, but I have been doing. So there is some reason I have that response.
We're only human. I have another question here. Can you talk about managing our self-expectations during this stressful time? I won't probably write the great American novel, lose 10 pounds, learn a second language, but I will survive. Great question, Molly.
That is a great question. And again, we as women put so much pressure on ourselves to do it all, to be the perfect mom, the perfect wife, to have the cleanest house. And those people that, well, I think all of us at some level, we fall short. During this time is to give ourselves a break. I think in general, we should give ourselves a break. Our kids will be fine if they don't have a bath for a couple of days. Our kids will be fine if we fall back a little bit on their homeschooling. Our kids will be less fine if we don't spend really quality time with them and be engaged and present and loving with them. And when we put all this pressure on ourselves of these outside things and these outside expectations, we're taking away really from that core of what our spirit is, which is to be connected with people and to love people.
That's really wonderful. Audience members, do you have any other questions for Joanne? I would love to share them with you. I know there's a lot of, people have a lot to deal with right now, but I guess before we say goodbye to Joanne, I will be...
I have one question though. I think we have a list of resources that people can call that we might want to go through or are you going to put it up on your website?
I was going to put it up on the screen after I thanked you.
Oh, I see.
Exactly what I was just about to say. Before we go, we have some mental health resources that I'm going to put up on the screen here. I was kind of waiting a little bit to see if anybody else had another question, but I will go ahead and let me see, share screen. I will put this up there. And there you go. There is the information for you, and we will also be putting this up on our website on CWHF.org. Joanne, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was very, very much appreciated by all of us. I'm sure you really gave us some good things to think about.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I had a really nice time, and just to all of the viewers, listeners out there, just take care of yourselves. We'll all get through this. I know some of you are experiencing more difficulties than others. Just be kind to each other.
Yes. And I also wanted to say that the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame offers free educational programs that are available to the public. And during this time, our virtual hall is more vital than it ever has been before. And we have programs for teachers, for parents who have become teachers, for businesses, for all kinds of different people like you. However, we need your help because it's through community support that we can keep these programs going. So your donation at any level is most welcome and very, very much appreciated. Thank you again for being on today's webinar, and we invite you to join us next Thursday when we present Karen Jarmock, the Chief Executive Officer of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and she'll be here to talk with us about the pandemic's impact on domestic violence. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you to our audience members. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.